All right. So let me quickly introduce Melanie. It's such an honor. Melanie is the Director of Product Management at Quip and Salesforce and a graduate from Wellesley in 2009. So without further ado, Melanie, please take it away and definitely feel free to add on to my really, really quick intro.
Yeah, thanks, Sabrina. Hi, everyone. It's great to have everyone here. Thanks so much for taking time out to be on yet another Zoom call, which I know is always everyone's under Zoom fatigue. So really appreciate your time, and hopefully through the next hour or so, I can teach you a few things and we can have a good discussion. So today I wanted to teach you some tactics on how you can understand your user better. It sounds like most of you, not all of you, are in the hackathon. And so if you do end up after this taking your hackathon and thinking more about it and potentially wanting to ship it, hopefully these skills will come in handy. Okay, so quickly, to add on to what Sabrina mentioned, just a little bit background about myself. I'm class of 2009, so I graduated about 11 years ago now. And I am currently a director of product at Quip, which is part of Salesforce. But I actually graduated with a chemistry degree, and I wasn't pre-med. I graduated, had no idea what I wanted to do. And so I moved back home. I'm from the Bay Area and started job searching, and then randomly ended up at Google as a recruiter. And so I started recruiting software engineers. That was my first job in tech, first experience, talking and working with software engineers every day, learning what they do, which is a really good learning experience. And then after that, I joined Yammer, which was basically a social network for your company. So modeled very similar to Facebook, but for your internal company use, to help provide better communication and collaboration with your employees. And I became a full cycle recruiter. So I recruited for software engineers, but designers, product managers, salespeople, admins, the whole gamut. And that's when I first came across product managers. And I thought it was really interesting. Again, this was back in 2009. So product management was fairly new. There weren't like boot camps or certificates you could get for product management. It was a very new role. And I really enjoyed working with product managers and learning about what they wanted to do. And I think graduating with a chemistry background, it really itched that need to have experiments, defining your hypothesis, running an experiment and learning from it. And so decided to transition to product management. It's a pretty big jump to go from recruiting to product management. And many people told me, go to business school, get your MBA. And I was like, that's a really expensive bet. And so I decided to take kind of a roundabout way to it, kind of figuring out okay, what skill sets do I need to become a product manager, and what other roles can I do to kind of take a 2-3 step jump towards that direction. So I became interested in project management first, and that's how I ended up at DARPA, which is part of the Department of Defense. It's basically our mad scientist research arm of the Department of Defense. And they came up with the internet, GPS, things like that, but really focusing on technologies for soldiers in our defense systems. And so there I worked on a specific program. I was basically a chief of staff for a program there that was building mobile apps for soldiers. And so at that point, it was, I think, just near the tail end of the Iraq War. A lot of our soldiers that I was working with were in Afghanistan and running missions. And so we were building mobile apps for these soldiers, basically like Google Maps, where they can see themselves, on the map, and then they could plot their route. If they take a picture, everything will be captured. They can plot objectives, and then they can see their comrades on the map as well, which was really cool. And previously, people would just use paper maps, and that's how they would run their mission. So a mobile app was a huge step up for them. And that was a really good learning experience to work with users that were very unlike myself. It's very hard to relate to these people. I didn't grow up in a military family. I had no idea what it was like to be a soldier. So it was a really steep learning curve to understand how these users did their job and how to build products for them, which is a really good learning experience. And then from there, I joined Pivotal, which was my first real product management job. And I first joined Pivotal Labs, which is an agile consultancy. So it's a consultancy that teaches companies how to build products in an agile way. And so companies would come into our office and I would literally sit with them day to day, teaching them all agile methodologies, from writing a user story to defining your MVP to prioritizing user stories, the whole gamut. So I did that for about 2 years. And then I joined a different part of Pivotal, which is Pivotal Cloud Foundry, which is a product that Pivotal built and sold, which was an app hosting platform. So if anybody's familiar with Heroku, maybe you're using Heroku for your hackathon, but if you're hosting an app on Heroku, the product I was working on is basically like Heroku, but for your own internal use at a company. So an easy way for developers to manage their whole app lifecycle. So that, very different user base. I was working with DevOps people, app developers, again, very unlike myself. So really important to learn how they did their job. And then currently I'm at Quip, which is a collaborative canvas to aggregate content and data to hopefully make you more productive. And Quip is a very generic tool. It can be used for anything. It's very similar to it's a kind of more modern Google Docs. You can imagine Google Docs can be used for a million different things. So it's really important to have your sights on what is your target user, what's your target use case, and build towards that. Or else you're just going to build a very kind of half-baked product for nobody, and nobody's going to use it. So that's a little about me. Next is a couple examples. So when you fail to understand your users, what are some examples of this? These are from many years ago, so hopefully some of them you have heard of at least. So Google Glass, I think they're bringing this back maybe, but Google Glass launched over a decade ago. It was really cool and kind of sci-fi looking, but the problem with it is that it had no defined core use cases. It had Google didn't say you should use Google Glass for XYZ. It was kind of it's cool, people have money, people will buy it and they'll figure it out. That was not the case. Nobody bought it, so they shut it down. The next one is Facebook Phone. Facebook partnered with HTC to build their own custom phone where Facebook was basically your operating system. Your home screen was your newsfeed. And nobody bought it because people realized, I don't want to be on Facebook all day. I don't want Facebook to do this in my life. But Facebook built the phone because that was their bad assumption. And Google Plus, this actually launched when I was at Google. This was Google's attempt to compete directly with Facebook. This was their social network. And it was slightly different from Facebook in the usability and kind of functionality, but not different enough to actually drive users from Facebook to Google. For example, they had a feature where they had a photo live stream. And the assumption there was that people would want to post photos in real time in their everyday life. And of course, people don't want to do that. So Google ended up sunsetting that product as well. So going back to understanding your user, I think it's really easy to say, you should be customer centric. You should really understand your user, but it's really hard. It's much easier said than done. I think the hard part is that when you talk to users, what they say they want is often not what they actually want. And so it takes a lot of effort to really peel back the layers to really, really understand what's the core problem, why they have this problem, and what's the best way to solve this. So there's a classic example, if anybody's read The Innovator's Dilemma, which is a famous book by Clay Christensen, he developed this framework called Jobs to be Done. And it was a framework to basically understand the behaviors your users have and what job are they hiring your product for. And so the famous example is many decades ago, McDonald's was trying to sell more milkshakes. They wanted to increase the sales of their milkshakes. And so with McDonald's, talk to users, probably in focus group, why do you like milkshakes? Why do you buy milkshakes? And from there, they probably asked very leading questions because as a result, they basically said okay, well, we want to make bigger milkshakes. We want to add more flavors. We want, thicker milkshakes. And so they did all this work and then, milkshake sales did not increase at all. And so they scratched their heads. They hired Christensen to come in and be Christensen, figure out how can we increase the sales of milkshakes? And so Christensen did a bunch of research, which I'll go into his methodology a bit here later in the slides. But basically, he discovered that customers bought milkshakes because they wanted to have something to consume on their commute to work. People had a long commute to work. They wanted something portable so they wouldn't get messy while they're driving. and something that, you know, would be satisfied and something that would take them a while to consume. So by the time they like bought the milkshake, they weren't hungry, but by the time they got to work, they were hungry. So they wanted to feel full by the time they got to work. And these are kind of things that you would never get by just asking a customer point blank, like, why do you buy a milkshake? Because customers don't really understand why they do certain things. So you really have to dig into it. And so ultimately, McDonald's said, like, okay, well, we're not competing with like Burger King milkshakes. We're actually competing with other breakfast foods. So how can we highlight milkshakes as a better breakfast food? I think this was many decades ago. I think we're a lot more health conscious now, so people are not drinking milkshakes for breakfast, but it's a really good example of how, you know, why people do certain things is not a very apparent. The next thing is, I think people have the urge to jump into solutionizing because it's fun. You know, it's really fun to think about like, oh, cool, like we can build this thing and the color of our logo can be this color and like we can lay things out this way. But if you don't really understand the core problem you're trying to solve and why you're trying to solve it, your solution is probably not going to be the best one. And the last thing is that, you know, your users are constantly evolving, especially if you're in technology. You know, there's new products coming out, your competitors are introducing new features all the time. And so you can't just do this once and hope, you know, think that you understand your user. You have to always keep a pulse on them because things are rapidly changing every day. So this is a continuous thing that you should do throughout your product development lifecycle. A famous quote that I'm sure everyone's heard is from Henry Ford, is that if you ask people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. You know, Henry Ford introduced the car for everyone. So it's always a good quote to capture it all. Okay, so now let's talk about tactics on how you can identify your target user. I wanted to talk through a simple framework that I use every day whenever I'm developing a new feature, which we call the discovery and framing framework. So you have two phases in this process. First is discovery, where you can see you're kind of figuring out like what problems there are to solve and then narrowing down what specific problems you want to focus on. And then framing goes into solutionizing. What solutions could potentially solve this problem? And then narrowing down like, okay, we want to build this one. And then the last few green circles here are representing iterating on that solution. So ship one version, learn some things, ship another version. So let's dive into discovery phase a bit more. So here we have discovery phase. So a few activities in the first part of this to identify problems are one-on-one interviews. You could do a focus group, you can do an observation study, or send out a survey to start. And then as the end result, you would hopefully have a stack rank list of problems your users have. So today I wanted to focus on the one-on-one interviews. So they're pretty easy to get started with and something that everyone can do. So to start with user interviews, you got to start somewhere, right? How do you figure out who to talk to? The first thing you should do is create a user persona. So literally you can grab a piece of paper and sketch ideas out and things you think. So basically you start with things that you think you know about your user. What assumptions do you have about this user? And you want to describe them as like a real person, you know, give them a name, draw like where they are in the world. Are they sitting in front of their computer? Are they on the go with a mobile phone? What have you? And from here, you can figure out, okay, we want to talk to these specific type of user personas. So here is actually an example of one that I have for my job. I did a big research study recently where we focused on understanding what various collaboration and productivity tools people use in the workplace. So whether it be Slack or Google Docs or what have you, what are the various tools they use and why they use them? And so here we have one persona, which is Beth, the boss. And so if I thought Beth, the boss was my target user, I would be like, okay, let's find all the Beth bosses that we know and interview them first. And this user persona is a living document. So as you go through these other exercises and you learn more about Beth, you should update Beth's persona. and keep it up to date. And so always reference it when you continue developing your product. So once you have your user persona, you know, like, okay, I want to interview Beth, the boss users. Now you start structuring your user interview process. So to start, we will generate assumptions, which will then inform what questions you want to ask your users, and then you'll actually interview your users. So assumption generation. This is a way to articulate what exactly you want to learn from these user interviews. So a quick exercise I usually do is I will sit down, I will have a stack of sticky notes, Post-it notes, and I will generate one assumption per sticky note. So I'll set a timer for 5 minutes, and as quickly as possible, I'll just jot down as many assumptions I'm making about this user. So for Beth the boss, it could be like, Beth uses email to communicate every day, or Beth is in one-on-one meetings all the time for every day. So generate all those assumptions, and then you want to plot those assumptions on a 2x2. So here on the x-axis, we have if something's easy or hard to validate. And then on the y-axis, we have if something's risky or more risky. And you really want to focus on the riskiest assumptions, so the top 2 quadrants here. And this is a really good exercise if you are working with a co-founder or you have multiple teammates that you want to have participate in the study. And so then everyone can generate them on the 2x2 and plot them on the 2x2, and then you can kind of figure out from there, what are the core assumptions we're making that we want to validate. So a quick exercise, since we have time, I'm curious, so looking at this picture, right? You have a construction worker on the job doing something, and say you want to build a mobile app for this user. What assumptions do you have about this user and what their job is, looking at this picture? If you add it to the comments, and then Sabrina can aggregate those. So imagine you want to build a mobile app for this user. What assumptions do you have about them?
So we have Renee, who said a need to be used one-handed.
Yeah. Anything about like their environment that we're assuming here?
There needs to be a focus on safety and works perfect. I'm assuming it's wear protection equipment for work, but
yeah,
the person who said that can definitely correct me. Okay, cool.
Definitely. Yeah, those are all great. So yeah, for example, one-handed, very much. And then also in this picture, like this person wears gloves. So does this person have to wear a glove while using the mobile app? That goes to the protection equipment. The other thing is like they're outside, it looks like. So does this mean that they'll have to use the mobile app when they're in direct sunlight, which means like their screen will probably have to be extra bright, or like maybe the icons and kind of the contrast will have to be have a high contrast. Then the other assumption here is like we're assuming that they are allowed to use mobile phones while on the job site. You know, are they allowed to, while they're carrying a beam, pull out their phone and do something? Yeah, all great assumptions, right? And all of those things, like if you are wrong about any of those assumptions, it could drastically, you know, make your product fail. So it's all really important to think about who your target user is and like what their environment is like. Awesome. Okay, and so once you generate your assumption and you generate your scripts, you know, what things you want to learn. A few tips for interviewing your users is, as I mentioned before, like get out of the building. You want to see these people in their natural habitat. So going back to the milkshake study, right? Christensen actually sat in a McDonald's for a whole day and watched people who bought a milkshake. And from there, he discovered that milkshakes were mostly bought in the morning before 8:30. And they're also usually bought as the only item. They didn't buy anything else with it. The other thing is to start with 5 users. So you don't have to interview a ton of users. You can just interview with 5 users. And there's statistics around that 5 users is the most number, it's the maximum number of users you need, or the minimum number of users you need to actually get some statistically sound insights from. And so once you interview these users, you'll get a bunch of insights. You want to synthesize that research. And then from there, you can update your user persona. And then from there, you'll probably be like, wow, we learned so much. We have new set of things that we want to learn. So then at that point, you can update your script and interview another set of 5 users. Hopefully from there, you'll have narrowed down and get a better sense of like who your Beth the boss is, for example, for your user persona. And then be like, okay, we want to target these users with these specific characteristics, and go from there. And so you do many cycles of this until you reach the point where you're like, yes, I know 95% sure that I understand my target user. Now we can actually move on into solutionizing. And so another quick tips for interviews is that there's this great book called The Mom Test. And the whole premise of this is like how to phrase your interview questions. You want to phrase your questions in a non-leading way. So an example, right, you have a son who's asking their mom like, oh mom, I have this great idea. Like, what do you think of it? You know, of course your mom's gonna be like, it's amazing, you should do it. So it's really important to figure out how you phrase your questions in a non-leading way to really get the true insights of this. And another, thing of like, you have to be wary of if the user's just trying to compliment you or being too generic. You really want to get into the weeds with them. And so it's really important to figure out how you can frame your questions in the best way to get those insights. This is a great quote from Teresa, who runs this great blog. But, she says, if you want to build a successful product, you need to understand your customers' actual behavior, their reality, and not just the story they tell themselves. So I think a classic example is like, if you go to the doctor's office, or if a doctor asks someone like, what do you eat, in a week? You probably would say like mostly healthy things. But if you actually ask the person to like keep a log of the food that they ate the week, probably very different. The reality that we tell ourselves is usually very different from the actual truth. So it's really important to, again, how do you ask questions to tease out those things? I personally like to ask user research questions in the form of like, instead of being like, hey, do you do XYZ? Instead be like, tell me about the last time you did this certain action, and see if actually XYZ actually does come up. Okay, so at the end of the discovery phase, you should have a stack rank list of user problems that you discovered. And from there, you want to choose, okay, which problem from here do we want to solutionize? Is it the number one problem? Or is it like the top 3 problems? They're all somewhat related, but slightly different, but we think that we can build a solution for the top 3. So once you determine what problems you want to solve, then we can go into the framing phase. So I'll stop there. Are there any questions about the discovery phase? Understanding user problems?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I had a question about your 2x2, and when you're evaluating how risky an assumption you make is, how do you go about like self-evaluating your own assumptions? Because I guess a lot of times your assumptions are based on just like a core set of principles you have, and how can you, I guess, self-evaluate that? That's like a really interesting thought, like 2x2 method, but yeah, how do you go about it?
Are you asking like, how do you self-evaluate if something's like risky, low risk or high risk?
Yeah, even? Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think doing the first time, you have to kind of just go off of your gut. And then from rounds of user interviews, it will help calibrate you to understand the risk or how hard or not hard it is to validate something. It's a good question. It's really just a guess, right? The 2x2 is just a way to help you get more focus, because if you have a list of 100 assumptions, you're not going to learn all the assumptions. It's going to take a lifetime. But the 2x2 is just a kind of quick, simple way to have a mental model to help filter down those assumptions to just be like, all right, let's focus on the top 10 here instead. But yeah, I think over time you'll just build that intuition as you get better understanding of your user base. You'll be able to calibrate yourself a lot better.
And what would just be like a quick example with like the construction worker? What would be like an example of a riskier assumption versus like a lower risk assumption made?
Yeah, I think a high risk assumption would be like they are allowed to have a mobile phone on the job. You know, that's if that's basically that risk, it will basically make your product unusable.
Okay,
That's what I mean by high risk. By low risk, it's like, okay, like if we're wrong about this, it might slightly impact the usage of our product, but it wouldn't completely, you know, take it off the table. So I think a lower risk one would be probably like the direct sunlight run, right? Like they have to be, the app has to be in high contrast because they're going to be in direct sunlight or different elements. That's something that you could easily solve for in the product.
All right, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about the discovery phase?
I have a question that I don't know if it's out of the scope of the talk or not, but is there anything you recommend to like limit personal bias or like implicit bias when trying to analyze what you're like hearing, like yeah, from turning that like what you hear into solutions or ideas for solutions? Like yeah, how to like reduce bias for that?
Yeah, no, it's a very hard thing to do, right? It's really hard to get rid of all bias. I think one, it's a lot about how you phrase the questions in a non-leading way. So basically more open-ended questions, so you can just let the user talk, say anything without leading them down like a certain path or opinion. And then I think one other tip is to record the actual interview so you can go back and actually pull out specific quotes. So you can summarize, you know, if you didn't record it or you didn't capture, like you could probably summarize something, what the person said or what they intended, what they meant. But there's a lot of bias that could creep in there. Versus if you had a recording and then you could actually go back and say like exactly like word for word what they said and analyze it when you have time, that will hopefully at least cut down on some of the bias. It's still going to be there, but I think having pure quotes will be really helpful. And then hopefully you'll have someone else with you, either during the interview or after the fact, who can also listen to the recording and help gut check you and either say like, oh, I agree with you, or like, no, I interpreted that completely differently than what you think.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other questions? Can we move on? Okay, let's move on. We can always circle back. Okay, so moving on is the framing phase. So you have your identified problem you want to focus on for your solution. Now we get into the fun solutionizing phase. So for framing, you want to first brainstorm a bunch of solutions. And then from there, we're going to do some activities to narrow down to figure out what specific solution we should be building. So some activities here is you can do wireframing, prototyping, and usability testing, and then have a stack rank list of the solutions that would best serve your problem. So for solutionizing, there's a couple tactics here. First, you got to brainstorm. My favorite way to brainstorm solution is do this crazy 8 exercise. So what you do is you take a physical piece of paper, very important, it has to be physical, and you fold it so it has 8 sections. And you basically set a timer for, I do 8 minutes, so 1 minute per drawing. And you draw in each square what the solution could be like. So here in this example, like this person is building a mobile app or a website, and they're kind of laying out different solutions for probably like maybe the homepage here. And this is also really great if you have a co-founder or teammates that you want to also brainstorm with. And so set the timer, everyone draws for 8 minutes, and after it, each person picks their top 3 solutions, and you go around the room and each person presents their top 3. And at the end, you can vote and be like, hey, we really love, Serena, your second option. And then that could be a potential for which ones you actually start prototyping with and really fleshing out. And so once you have kind of a rough mock, and then you can go into, Figma or Sketch or whatever program you use to actually start building out the wireframe or clickable prototype. So you can actually put it in front of some users to get feedback. So usability testing is the way that you can test your solution with users. So this example, this image is an example of a kind of a rough wireframe where it kind of shows different parts of this product, different pages. And I've shown this fidelity of wireframes to users. And so I will literally show them, like, here you go, like, can you describe to me what you see? And how do you interpret what I've designed here? To kind of just get a sense of, is this design intuitive? And then also when you want to test usability and kind of user experience, you can be more specific and be like, hey, like when you click this button, what would you expect to happen? Or when you do this certain action, what would you expect to happen? So it's a good way to, without leading the witness, see if your design is actually intuitive, and then ultimately, is it solving the problem that you originally tried to solve? And again, you should only do this with 5 users. Once you interview 5 users, you get your feedback, you'll tweak your designs, and then interview another set of 5 users. And then you keep doing that until you reach a point where, like, we've reached a solution, we're ready to start building. So the end goal of the framing phase, again, is to have that one solution that you all agree on, that you feel like will solve the original problem. And then you can actually start coding or building or whatever thing you're going to do. And so once you build, you can ship it. And so I always, coming back from my agile methodology background, is always trying to ship the smallest little thing that you can, where you can actually learn something. And so defining your MVP, how can you scope down that solution to basically the bare bones of, if we ship this, what actions or what metrics do we want to move where we can actually learn something? So the alternative to this is that you build, your entire solution. You spend weeks, you spend months building it, and then you ship it, and then nobody uses it. And then what? You wasted all that time. Versus, how can we scope it down, save time, save resources, and ship the smallest thing? So the smallest possible thing you could probably ship is a landing page, right? Like Dropbox did this initially, where they just put up a landing page with their value prop, see how many people signed up, because people wanted that solution. That's a very bare bones. You could probably extend that a bit more, where if you were building, an app that required like a profile account, right? Like, do you really need a fully fleshed out profile account versus just what key information do you need up front to allow your user to complete their action? And so shipping is always it's another way to learn about your user, right? So every feature you ship, every iterative of a design you ship should be a way to learn. And you should always articulate, like, okay, when we ship this version, what are we hoping to learn? Are we hoping people will do this action more, or this other action more? Or will they buy more things? Will they hire more cars? What have you? And you just continue iterating that way. Okay, before we jump into data, any questions around the framing phase? Framing is the fun part, so hopefully everyone gets
note, oh, sorry. As a side note, if anyone is like uncomfortable with speaking or unmuting, you can always private message me. I'll read the question out for you.
Okay, let's move on. We can do Q&A at the end. Okay, and so what I just mentioned, what I just went through, was very focused on user interviews. There's many different ways to learn about your users. I just highlighted user research as the main one. But as I mentioned previously, you could do this through surveys. You can send out surveys to your users with specific questions to help validate your assumptions. Surveys, only get you so far. It's so much more rich and informative when you can actually talk to a user one-on-one. But a survey is a good way if you have, a wide general user base that you want to get started with. You can set a survey out to help narrow down like what type of user you want to interview. You could do focus groups. You could do a focus group with like 10 people, interview 10 people all at once. Again, that introduces some bias because when one person in the group says something, it could bias the other people to agree with them or disagree with them. Yeah, there's many different ways that you could do to do the discovery phase. Okay, data. Data is very important, especially in this day and age in product development. I think data is a very good complement to qualitative data. So quantitative data can help explain what people do, what actions are people doing. If you have a defined funnel, like a sign up funnel, you can analyze that and see like, oh, people are really dropping off at this phase. Going back to the milkshake study, right? Like you could, back in the day, if Christensen had some quantitative data, you wouldn't have to sit outside at McDonald's for one full day. But, you could analyze the data of like, when are milkshakes most sold? Are they sold with other products at the same time? And so those things you can understand. However, it still won't tell you why they bought the milkshake, right? If you went off the data alone, then you might build, you might ship bigger milkshakes or add more flavors. However, the qualitative data really explains the why people bought the milkshake, right? They bought it because they had a long commute to work and they needed something to drink on their way to work. And so if you had to, the other thing too is like for quantitative data to be informative, you have to have a good sized user base to have those insights be statistically significant. So if you only have 10 users, the data that you can analyze is not going to be statistically significant. You might as well just interview those 10 users. But if you have millions of users, like Facebook, who is very data driven, data has a huge lift, has a huge weight on understanding your user. So it really depends on what type of product you are building and how large your user base is. Personally, if I had to choose one over the other, I would have chosen qualitative research. I just think it's a lot lower barrier entry to get that insights, and the insights you'll get are a lot richer than just purely looking at numbers and trying to correlate why those numbers are the way they are. And the last thing is, all I'll just say is that building a product should always just be about learning. You should find different ways to learn about your user. You should treat every feature launch as an opportunity to learn about them. And over time, as you learn more about your user, as you ship more features, you'll fill your intuition bucket. I think a lot of people say like Steve Jobs, is the greatest innovator of our time because he had just such deep intuition for our users. And, Steve Jobs didn't do like user research studies, but over time, he just built a really strong intuition of what people wanted. And so Steve Jobs are not born out of nothing. Steve Jobs was in the industry for decades, had many failures. And at the end of the day, like he was really good at understanding his users, but he went through many trials and tribulations to get there. So people who just go off on their pure intuition without understanding their user, they're usually not going to be very successful. But over time, if you really hone this muscle, hopefully you will have a really strong intuition for your specific user base. And going back to the agile methodology, it's all about shipping the smallest thing so you can course correct easily. You don't want to spend all your time and resources building one specific thing, then shipping it, and then having to course correct. It's a lot more expensive and time consuming versus being like, hey, instead of shipping like all 10 features at once, can we just ship 2, assess how it's being used, and then course correct when needed? And yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Any questions I can answer or any feedback?
I guess I had a more like less on the presentation, but more about your background and your career.
Yeah.
How was it transitioning from like, first of all, your chemistry background and then into a tech role and then into like product and project management? Because that's like a really similar thing I'm going through right now as a new grad. But yeah, so I'd love to learn more.
Yeah. Do you go to Wellesley?
No, I actually graduated early this past semester from Yale with an environmental engineering degree, but I'm now working at Qualtrics. So I'm just like wondering how you found, I guess, like how you found your niche within the tech world and like how you pivoted and how you kind of leveraged your own strengths to get the role you wanted.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say I was very naive when I went to college and was like, I picked chemistry because like I really liked chemistry in high school. Bad reason to major in something, but I kind of like stuck to my guns, did it, and then learning more about like what jobs I could get for the chemistry degree, I was like, these are not interesting to me. I don't want to be in lab 8 hours a day. So I was really lucky because I fell into tech. I didn't seek to be in tech. I just happened to be, you know, the industry that I was surrounded with, which I'm very grateful for. But I think it's also just trying different things. You know, I just kind of went with an open mind in recruiting, not knowing anything about it. And from there, you kind of learn like what aspect of your job do you like versus what you don't like. So from recruiting, I really liked tech. I like talking and working with engineers. The things I didn't like the monotonous nature of recruiting. You know, it's like you hire someone, you do it again, and it's never ending cycle. And it's also very isolating. You work just by yourself. You don't have like a team of people you work with. You're pretty much a lone wolf. And so then I joined Yammer, which was a very small company at the time, which is a very different dynamic to a giant Google. And from there, again, you kind of assess like what you like about this, what you don't like. I liked a bit more because it was a much more collaborative environment because we were so small. But at the end of the day, I realized like I just didn't like recruiting. You know, I didn't like the very kind of like sales cycle type of job. And I was lucky because I was introduced to product management there, where I started hiring product managers. So I started learning about the role and then talking to product managers. And I think it was a great way to kind of get insight in the product management role versus I think today, a lot of, you know, product management is like this elusive, like glamorous thing that nobody really understands what product managers do. But, you know, many people I talk to like, I want to be a product manager. And like, when I ask them, like, why do you want to be a product manager? They're like, I don't know, it just seems cool. And I'm like, okay, well, you should probably do some more research and talk to, you know, actual product managers to learn more about what the actual role is. But I think I was really lucky because I was like on the ground with them. And so I really could have actual conversations with these people and really assess out if it's something I was interested in. And I was also, I think, lucky because product management wasn't this like shiny, like sexy thing that nobody defined. It was like still very new where it didn't have this glamour to it. So once I set the sights on product management though, like that was a hard journey to like break into product management. Because as I mentioned, like people typically hired product managers either directly from business school or they were software engineers who like kind of converted into or hired into product management through various programs. And so I kind of did this roundabout way where I try to figure out like what skill sets product managers needed and try to just like find jobs that could tackle a few of those. And over time, hopefully acquire enough skills where I could be a product manager. I think nowadays there's so many like APM programs and boot camps and certificates that you can get that could be good baselines for product management. But I think ultimately, one, to assess if you really wanted to be product managers, I think the best way is to talk to product managers and really understand what they do. And then also product managers at different companies are very different, you know. Yeah, any other questions from that?
No, that was like very thorough. Thank you so much for answering it and just walking through your career again. But thank you.
Definitely. Any other questions?
I don't know if someone, oh, okay. Never mind. Yeah, if anyone, just another reminder, if you're uncomfortable in a meeting, you can always type in the chat and I'll ask it for you.
Is anybody working on a hackathon project they want to get advice on or get feedback on? I'm curious what people are working on.
Yeah, well, my team is looking at redesigning Google Wave.
Ooh.
Yeah, which is very exciting. And yeah, I guess you said you worked on a kind of like a Facebook Messenger thing, but for the workplace. What was that like? I guess that would be helpful in helping us define our product as well.
Yeah, Yammer was probably with the first like social, like enterprise social networking company, before Slack, before any of those. It's interesting, Facebook, this is fairly, I think Facebook probably like launched maybe 5-6 years before Yammer did. And so Yammer was literally looked very similar to Facebook. You had a news feed, like very similar layout, because our assumption was people are used to Facebook. So if we build it to look like Facebook, onboarding would be a lot easier and just like a lot more intuitive. I would say, I think the core problem that Yammer sought out to solve was basically the problem of email, right? Email is the bane of many people's existence, even today, where each email thread is a silo. It's only the people on that thread have that information, and it's very slow. It's like you have to like write your email, click send, have the person open it, eventually write their mail, send. It's like it's a waiting game. But I think the big thing is that the information, the content in the email is siloed. And so Yammer was really about how can we break down those silos and have people share information more widely with their peers. And so with the concept of a news feed, right, it's like you can have a conversation in this public channel, and even people who are not in that conversation, they can look at it either in real time or after the fact and see what was discussed, what decisions were made, what context was shared. So people don't have to constantly email that person and get context one-on-one. So that was the main thing that Yammer sought out to solve. And so I think Yammer was really successful. It was sold to Microsoft for $1 billion only after a few years, because it was very focused on that specific problem that we were trying to solve. Versus, I feel like that type of product, it's really easy to fall into, like Quip, like a very generic tool that can solve many problems, but not well. So I think Yammer did a really good job of really honing on like what specific problems are we trying to solve right now.
Great, thank you. And I guess that's just really making sure like the second half of the first diamond is really strong, like the prioritization of the problem is very
exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think even for a product like Google Wave, right? Like it could solve many problems depending on the type of user. Mm-hmm. And so when you get to solutionizing, it's easy to, if you don't narrow down the problems you want to solve, it's really easy to get distracted. And then your solution kind of like goes down this crazy, like windy path of like, one day you're solving this problem and the next week you're solving a completely different problem. And you kind of end up with like this Frankenstein solution. So I think the whole concept of discovery and framing is to like really narrow your focus. And then once you validate that solution, then you can expand that solution to solve other problems. But you should really start with a very narrow problem and a narrow solution, and then build out from there.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
We do have a question from the chat saying, asking, can you do user testing via survey by using videos and questions?
Yeah, is it for like the discovery, like the problem part or the solutionizing part?
That wasn't specified, but if the person
Okay,
wanted
I think
specify solution part.
the solution part. Yeah, you can. I think the best way to do that virtually is if you have like a clickable prototype that you could send them. So either via Envision, I think maybe Figma does this now, where you can literally send them a link. So you set up your video call, right? You send them the link, you have them share their screen so you can watch them actually click through the prototype. And then just like if you're in person, right? You just ask them prompts like, okay, like you land on this page, what do you see? Explain to me what you see, what you think this page is about, and then guide them through it. I think it's also really cool when you can watch them because I'm sure they'll start clicking around. You can start seeing like where their attention goes. And so they start trying to do something that, you know, was not designed to do. You should still be able to see that. And then you can dig into like, oh, what are you trying to do? Why are you clicking on that thing? But yeah, I think doing that virtually is almost, if not better than doing it in person, because you can actually see their screen, assuming that your product is a digital product. Obviously, if it's like a hardware product, then it might be harder to do it virtually.
I'm not sure if there's any other questions. I do have one, and this is also like more catered towards like your experience. How do you balance between like user goals and like business or like product goals?
Yeah. Well, so I would say if you're running a business, you know, your business goals should always be top of mind. You know, you're trying to drive a business metric, but then how you drive that metric is down to like what product you build. And so you should have flexibility on like what you ship. So I think going back to the milkshake idea, right? Like McDonald's, their business objective was to increase the sales of milkshakes. How they did that, they didn't really care, right? They tried a myriad of different things, but the end of the day, they ended up figuring out like, oh, we want to market this as a breakfast item and highlight that versus expanding milkshake flavors. So I think as a product manager, at least, like, you know, your business metrics are always top of mind, but then you have the flexibility, and that's where the innovation comes from. Is like, how can we move this top level business metric? So if for Facebook, right, they want to acquire more users, like that's their business metrics, so they can sell more ads ultimately, right? And as a product manager at Facebook, I would have, hopefully would probably be in a proper area, but you would have free reign to figure out like, okay, how can we like move this goal of acquiring more users or getting more people to be more active in Facebook every day so we could sell more ads. But yeah, I think the top level message is kind of like the top like North Star, and then the product goals are ways to move that metric.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for answering that.
Yeah.
And just keeping an eye on time, and if there's no more questions, I just want to start wrapping this up. First of all, like, thank you, Melanie, so much for sharing all of that and answering all of our questions with such like insight. I just want to remind everyone who's still here that we have another workshop right after this. It's discussing why startups fail. And I kind of copied the Zoom link down below, but you can also find it on our Notion page, also on our Discord. But other than that, thank you, Melanie, so much for your time. And thank you, everyone here, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, everyone. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn, message me if you have any questions or want to connect and talk about product. I'm happy to talk after this.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.